So first of all, we want to create a government that works for all of us, and we want to create a political system which is based on one person, one vote, not billionaires buying elections as a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision. I believe that health care is a human right, not a privilege. Okay? We have got, as a nation, to reject Trump's idea that climate change is a hoax. We have over 1 million people who have signed up to volunteer on the country.
All right, Senator. Okay. We're going to give you the floor here for a closing statement.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yes. We want to give you a chance to give a closing statement.
That was a town hall Bernie Sanders did on Fox News in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Did you know that Bernie Sanders has been the most popular senator in America for years? At one point, he was actually the most popular politician in America. Did you know that Medicare for All and free college are more popular than not? In late 2018, polls found that 52% of Republicans supported Medicare for All. And in late 2019, polls found that 55% of all voters agree with Medicare for All. Did you know that 58% of Americans support free college and eliminating student loan debt? So why is it, when you listen to supposedly liberal news channels like CNN and MSNBC, you hear stuff like this?
Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl, and I can't even identify for you what exactly it is, but I see him as sort of a not pro-woman candidate.
New rankings came out. He's the most popular senator in the entire country. So
That's
part
not
of
true.
why...
No,
that literally came out last week. Morning Consult polling ranked him as the #1 most popular senator in the entire country.
Furthermore, why did Bernie Sanders lose to Joe Biden, who does not share Bernie's popular policy positions? Until Super Tuesday, things were looking really good for Bernie. In fact, Bernie Sanders is the first presidential candidate in the history of the United States to win the popular vote in the first 3 voting states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Biden then won South Carolina, but suddenly, on Super Tuesday, Biden won most of the states, overtaking Bernie's delegate lead in a huge way that the polls did not see coming. Here's the chart that 538 has for tracking the Democratic candidates and how likely they are to win the nomination. As you can see, going into Super Tuesday, Bernie was comfortably in the lead, and Biden's chances were abysmal. Here's what 538 predicted the week before. As you can see, it predicted Bernie would have a great night, winning Vermont, Colorado, Utah, and California, polling ahead of the rest in Arkansas, North Carolina, and Virginia, whereas Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Texas were more of a coin toss. In the end, Sanders was predicted to come out strong, leading Biden by almost 200 delegates. Instead, Biden completely overperformed expectations and won the night. Let's see how much Biden won Super Tuesday by. Biden won 10 out of the 14 states voting. Bernie only won Vermont, Colorado, California, and Utah. Biden now had almost 100 more delegates than Bernie and carried this momentum onto victory for the rest of the primary. North Dakota would be the only state Bernie would win after Super Tuesday. Isn't the point of a democratic system that candidates who hold the most popular positions will get elected to represent the will of the people? How is it then that in the 2020 Democratic primary, the candidate with the most popular positions and a lifelong record of supporting those positions, not to mention directly participating in the civil rights movement, lost to a candidate who doesn't support those positions, who was caught lying about participating in the civil rights movement? How did this happen? I've heard a couple of different ideas on why Bernie Sanders lost the primary. Some that come to mind are the idea that Sanders wasn't aggressive enough towards Biden, and that Warren acted as a spoiler candidate during the primary. But in this video, I'll be focusing on the role that mainstream media outlets played in the 2020 primary. Let me explain. As I briefly showed at the beginning, Sanders is a very popular politician. His numbers don't paint the picture of a divisive radical. But just because you like Sanders and his policies doesn't mean you'll vote for him. I've talked to several Democratic voters who like Sanders and his policies, but still didn't vote for him. The reason, singular, not plural, was electability, saying things like, I just don't know if Sanders can get enough moderate voters in the South to beat Trump. Or they would strategize, saying that moderate Republicans and independents won't be willing to vote for Sanders, but they will be willing to vote for a moderate Democrat, who Democrats would vote for anyway. Or they would say things like, How are you going to get millions of working people to vote to give up their private health insurance? Essentially, they were worried that Bernie wasn't electable. But how do you judge who's electable? And if you think his ideas are so great, why do you think it's impossible to convince others that his ideas are great as well? What is electability? I will try to answer these questions and more. If you give me the chance, I'll try to convince you of 5 things in this video. First, that the majority of both Democratic voters and Americans as a whole agree with the progressive policies of Bernie Sanders and Warren over the centrist policies of Biden. Second, that a significant portion of Democratic voters voted for Biden not because of agreement on policy issues, but out of a sense that Biden was somehow more electable than Bernie. Third, that the portion of voters who voted for Biden for electability reasons were enough for Bernie to lose the primary. Fourth, even against popular opinion, mainstream media outlets, particularly CNN and MSNBC, decisively unified to attack Bernie and successfully manufactured consensus within their viewership that Bernie was too extreme, not electable, and more, by either ignoring him or disproportionately covering his campaign in a negative light. Then, I want to convince you that these mainstream media companies and the type of pundits they have on have a direct financial incentive to oppose Bernie Sanders and progressive policies. First, let's see how popular Sanders as a candidate as well as his policies really are. In late 2017, Bernie Sanders was actually the most popular politician in America. Since then, that has changed a bit, though he remains highly popular, and for the past few years, Sanders has been the most popular senator in America. But where does Sanders stand in relation to Biden? Both Biden and Sanders are similarly popular. According to Quinnipiac poll data about 1 month before Super Tuesday, Bernie and Biden are almost matched in favorability, with Bernie leading Biden by just 1 point. However, according to a YouGov poll that was conducted just 1 week before Super Tuesday, Sanders is 5% more popular than Biden is. When you factor in the approval of Democrats and independents combined, Sanders still leads Biden by 4 points. Interestingly, among Democrats, Elizabeth Warren was more popular than Sanders and Biden, beating Sanders by 1 point. Another poll done about 2 weeks before Super Tuesday by USA Today and Ipsos asked Americans which politicians shared their values and which politicians have characters that they admire. 40% of Americans say they admire Sanders' character, compared to Biden's 30%. 39% of Americans say that Sanders shares their values, compared to Biden's 30%. Among Democrats, 64% said that Sanders shares their values. 53% said the same for Biden. Now, for this video, we'll focus on one of Sanders' main policies, Medicare for All. This is perhaps Sanders' signature policy proposal and one that Biden opposes. Importantly, there's also lots of data on this policy that we can analyze. Sanders' Medicare for All, also known as single-payer or universal health care, would replace most private insurance with coverage from the government, which is the single-payer mentioned in the name. Biden, along with a few other centrist Democrats, advocate for expanding on Obamacare, also called a public option, in which one has an option to purchase a government insurance plan alongside the private plans that we have now. In late 2019, a Morning Consult poll found that 55% of all voters supported Medicare for All when told that they can keep their doctor and their hospital, which is in fact a primary feature of single-payer healthcare. And since we're talking about the Democratic primary, the poll found that 78% of Democrats support Medicare for All. But these are mostly polls done before Super Tuesday. How did voters feel the day they voted? Luckily, on Super Tuesday, voters filled out exit polls, which are polls that are filled after voting. These polls asked voters questions like who they voted for what reason, what their ideologies are, and how they feel about certain issues. I will be using exit poll data reported by the Washington Post. Now, check this out. In the Super Tuesday primary polls, Democratic voters in every state except Arkansas, Utah, and American Samoa were asked, how do you feel about replacing all private insurance with a single government plan for everyone? In every single state this question was asked, Democratic voters supported replacing private health insurance with single-payer health insurance, which is Bernie's plan. You know what's crazier? This isn't just true for Super Tuesday states. Every state in the Democratic primary that we have exit polling for has had more support for replacing private insurance with a single-payer plan than opposition to it. Yes, even the states that Biden won overwhelmingly want single-payer healthcare over private insurance. And by the way, these polls didn't just ask whether or not voters want universal health care. They specifically asked, How do you feel about replacing all private health insurance with a single government plan for everyone? This is important. The Real Clear Politics poll done in 2019 found that if you ask Americans if they support Medicare for all, where they get their health insurance through the government, 65% of voters support it. But when you ask the same question, but also tell them that Medicare for all will eliminate all private insurance companies, the support drops down to 55%. So even when the exit polls used the question that lowers support for Medicare for all, it was still undefeated in every state. Interestingly, in late 2018, Medicare for all was much more popular. An American Barometer and Hill TV poll found that 70% of Americans overall either strongly or somewhat support Medicare for all. That's a lot more than the 55% or so we have today, and believe it or not, the largest change that happened was not with Democrats, but with Republicans. That's right, in 2018, 52% of Republicans either strongly or somewhat supported Medicare for all. Today, only 25% of Republicans support it. So what changed between 2018 and now? Well, quite simply, the issue became politicized. Just like tuition-free college, Medicare for all became strongly associated with Sanders and the term socialism, thanks to relentless reporting from Fox News and rhetoric from the Trump administration. But think about that. In less than 2 years, conservative leaders and media have been able to take a policy that was popular with their base and, using messaging and political associations, cut that support in half. Keep that in mind as we go on. Now, to be fair, just because you prioritize electability and voted for Biden doesn't mean that you didn't also agree with Biden's policies. It's possible to believe that beating Trump is more important than policies, and believe that Biden is more electable than Bernie, and agree with Biden's policies over Bernie's at the same time. However, because of the exit polling that we saw earlier, we know this isn't the whole story. Remember, Medicare for all, which is Bernie's policy, had higher support in every single Democratic primary, not just in Super Tuesday states. Keeping private insurance, which is Biden's policy, lost in every single state. Just based on this, if everyone who voted based on policy agreement, Bernie should have won almost every state, if not every state altogether. So, again, what happened on Super Tuesday? Well, when we look at the exit polls, we can not only see what percentage of voters want Medicare for all, but what percentage of those voters voted for Bernie or Biden. Here's a chart that I made that shows what percentage of voters support Medicare for all and still voted for Biden. After putting all the numbers together, on average, over 27% of voters who support Medicare for all voted for Biden. This means that over 1 out of 4 voters who support Medicare for all voted for Biden anyway. What's the explanation for this? Well, in a Huffington Post survey done about a month and a half before Super Tuesday, 60% of voters believed that Biden was able to beat Trump, compared to the 52% who thought Sanders could beat Trump. Also, 23% of registered voters even said that they would vote for someone who isn't their favorite, but who they thought could win. That's pretty similar to the 1 in 4 number we just got. What this shows is that going into the 2020 primary, Democratic voters highly prioritized beating Trump over policy positions. This held true during Super Tuesday voting. Again, we can look at the charts that the Washington Post provided. On the Super Tuesday exit polls, voters were also asked whether or not they'd nominate a candidate who could beat Trump or a candidate that agrees with you on the issues. On average, about 62% of voters said that they'd rather nominate a candidate who can beat Trump, compared to about 35% who'd prefer a candidate who agrees with them on the issues. Now, within the 62% who value electability over policies, we can see who they ended up voting for. Who do they think is more electable? Well, it's not even close. Of the voters who voted based on electability, about 43% of them voted for Biden, versus about 23% for Sanders. The only states that thought Sanders was more electable than Biden were Vermont and Colorado, and even in Colorado, it was only by 1%. By the way, I checked whether or not this phenomenon also goes the other way, whether or not lots of people who supported Biden's policies voted for Bernie instead. I crunched the numbers with the same data, and it's not even close. On average, only 11% of people who oppose single-payer voted for Bernie anyway, compared to the 27% of people who favor single-payer and voted for Biden anyway. It's also worth noting that voters who favored moderate policies were able to unify around Biden, whereas voters who favored progressive policies split their vote between Bernie, Biden, and Warren. Before we move on, I think it would be a good idea to analyze two groups of voters who came out particularly strong for Biden. These two groups are late deciders and black voters. According to the exit polls, about 3 in 10 voters on Super Tuesday were late deciders who decided who to vote for a few days before or on the day of voting. Early deciders, or people who decided who to vote for months or weeks before voting, voted for Bernie over Biden. About 47% of late deciders voted for Biden, compared to only about 21% of late deciders who voted for Bernie. Now, the exit polling data doesn't allow us to see exactly why late deciders were so much more likely to vote for Biden, but I think we can make some educated guesses why. If you only give yourself a few days or less to decide who to vote for, you're very likely to be a low information voter. You probably haven't looked into the different candidates and compared and contrasted their policies and records. Instead, you're probably making your decision based on vague impressions and intuition. You might simply vote for the candidate whose name you're more familiar with, and if you're the kind of Democrat who doesn't care whether or not you want Medicare for all, you might think something like, well, I like both Bernie and Biden, and I might even like Bernie a little more, but either one of them would be much better than Trump, so I'm going to vote for who I think is more electable. But if you're not following the polls, you're not deciding who's more electable based on any actual data. You're just going off intuition, and intuition says that the most moderate candidate with the most name recognition appeals to the most people. And Biden is both moderate and well known as the former vice president. I think this kind of thought process helps explain why late deciders came out strong for Biden in the way they did. Finally, let's take a look at black voters. On Super Tuesday, black voters played a huge role in Biden's victory, especially in southern states. Based on the states that we have data for, Biden got about 55% of the black vote on Super Tuesday, while Sanders only got less than 21%. Considering the fact that Bernie Sanders was arrested for participating in the civil rights movement back in 1963, and as late as 2017, Biden bragged about working with segregationists, this is a real mystery to me. Unfortunately, similar to the late voters, we can't look specifically at the black voter answers in the exit polls and see why they voted for their chosen candidates. I wish we had more hard data to go off of, but I think it's worth taking a look at these two articles that were written about why black voters favor Biden so much. Both these articles were written by black writers. One of them uses polling data, and the other directly interviews black voters. The common theme between them, however, I think will become obvious. The first is a Washington Post article written by Theodore Johnson. The article is simply called, "Why do black voters support Biden? They just want to beat Trump." From the article, Biden certainly owes some of his early success to his tenure as Barack Obama's vice president, but a fuller explanation has to do with the politics of pragmatism. When it comes to presidential races, black voters, perhaps more than any other demographic, vote not for what might be gained, but according to what might be lost. The second article interviewed a panel of older black voters and had them rank their favorite Democratic candidates and give their reasons why. I think this article is fascinating. Biden was ranked number 1. Let's see what the article has to say. Biden comes in at the top spot for senior week on the power rankings, but not for the reasons that you would think. Nobody liked him exclusively because of Obama. Nobody liked him because they thought he had the best policies. The committee ranked him first this week because he's the only candidate they thought had the experience and maturity to actually run the government and serve black people's interests. Committee members see the relationship with Biden as transactional, not trust and love. He's the one Democrat that will owe black folks the most if he wins, and thus, he's more likely to deliver when he does. One voter said, "I don't think Biden will do a damn thing for black people, but he knows he needs black votes to win, so he'll do what's necessary for us. That's better than most." Hang on, I'm confused. So is Biden not going to do a damn thing for black people? Or is he going to do what's necessary for black people to get their vote? Which one is it? Anyway, the article goes on. One committee member mentioned Biden's gaffe during the 2012 election when he said that Mitt Romney would put black folks back in chains. That didn't bother me, because Joe Biden knows what he's talking about. He knows just how vicious white folks of his generation are, because he is one. But he knows his success comes from making sure we're happy, because he ain't weighing enough of the white vote. So Elizabeth Warren came in second. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because Warren isn't the focus of this video, but I did want to share this one passage from the article. The committee liked her endorsement from Julian Castro, her bankruptcy plan, and everyone noted that she had a literal plan for everything. So what's the drawback? First, Most committee members don't believe America will elect a female president against Donald Trump. Again, electability is key. Now for Sanders. The article writes, Sanders comes in third, and he's pretty popular with our black senior committee, with a few caveats summed up by one of our committee members. Bernie would do more for black people than Biden, but he's totally unelectable. Middle-class white people are not going for all that free shit. They say they will, but they don't want to share with black folks or Latinos, so they always back out at the polls. They just won't do it. Rich, liberal white people like his plans in theory, but they won't vote for a socialist. Another quote. Let's say Bernie gets the nomination. The Democrats will have to put up a black man, a white woman, and a Jewish socialist, and that's supposed to win back conservative working-class white men in the Midwest? Like his policies, but he's arrogant and not a winner. So, as we can see, the common theme here is black voters like Bernie's policies and even think he'd do more for them than Biden, but they just don't think that Bernie is electable, whereas Biden is. Before we move on, there was one more quote from the article I just had to share. Remember how Bernie directly participated in the civil rights movement? Well, one panelist directly addresses that. Here's what they have to say. I knew guys like him in the civil rights movement. They have a messiah complex, that they know better than black people and that economics is everything. Plenty of populist movements left out black people. I wanted to mention that because it annoys the shit out of me. These panelists explicitly say that Joe Biden won't do a damn thing for them, but they're going to vote for him anyway because they know that Joe knows that he has to get their vote to win. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders was arrested while fighting for their civil rights, but this shows that he has a messiah complex and he thinks he knows better than black people? To be fair, there's no indication that these statements were made by the same person, but this is a perfect example of how Joe Biden gets every free pass in the world, and Bernie just isn't allowed to win. Why do people think like this? Well, at the beginning of the article, there's this line. Black folks, especially retired black people, can be trusted to do a few things. Go to church, consume nighttime dramas on network TV, and watch a ton of MSNBC. Continuing. And I regularly appear at one of those locations. Hey, wait a second. Who wrote this article? Jason Johnson? Where have I heard that name before? We'll get back to that in a bit. So, at this point, I'm hoping I've convinced you that a huge portion of people who voted for Biden did so out of a sense that he was simply more electable, and not because his policies are especially popular. But what is electability? In a democracy where everyone has the right to vote, the candidate with the most popular policies should be the one who wins, right? Isn't the entire point of a democracy that politicians who most accurately reflect the will of the people, for better or worse, are appointed to represent them? But as we just saw, apparently, having the most popular policies is not the same thing as being the most electable. People like Bernie, and they like his policies, and they think he shares their values more than any other politician, but then suddenly when asked who is more electable, they say it's Biden. So again, what is electability if it's not who most people agree with or like? It seems that electability is a mind game. It's not a metric that represents anything real about the candidate. It's the result of people asking themselves, who will everyone else vote for? Voting based on electability instead of the policies that you personally like requires you to put yourself in the shoes of thousands of people that you don't even know. It requires you to guess about the motivations and thought processes of millions of people who you haven't met and will never meet. So if you're hell-bent on beating Trump above all else, and you've taken on the task of predicting how millions of strangers will vote, how do you go about educating yourself on how other people feel? Well, you could go about the inconvenient task of keeping yourself up to date on all the different polls that keep track of voter opinions on the many different policies and candidates that represent them, but that's really time-consuming. When you have a job and a family and bills to catch up with, who has the energy to keep track of all the different polling organizations and fluctuating numbers and news stories? Why go through the effort when we have professionals on TV to do it for us? Indeed, many voters, mostly older ones, still look to mainstream media companies to provide analysis of the news for them, and to represent the variety of opinions that voters around the country hold. However, I'm sorry to say, the media is not an objective, neutral, magic mirror that reflects the real facts of reality. Mainstream media outlets like CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, and more may be less biased and more trustworthy than something like InfoWars, but these media outlets have dangerous biases of their own. These biases add up over time, enough that anyone who consistently watches these outlets will have their own worldview molded to more closely match the world presented through them. As I've hinted, these outlets do not like Bernie Sanders. The outlets I just mentioned, and others like them, are parts of multi-billion-dollar corporations. Their top anchors are all millionaires. Simply put, Bernie Sanders' agenda of taxing the rich does not align with the financial interests of these media companies. I would like to show you a series of facts that I believe demonstrate this bias, but before I do, let me stress that my criticism of the mainstream media is not the same as Trump's, or the right wing in general. Trump calls the mainstream media fake news and the enemy of the people when they happen to criticize him. I'm not here to say that the media is the enemy of the people, but they do have a bias towards the status quo, and that bias works against any politician who wishes to change the status quo, and any voters who might be considering those candidates. I could literally devote hours of content to just showing the many cases of institutional bias against political candidates that rock the boat, and I might do just that in the future, but for now, I want to present to you what I think are the clearest examples of this establishment bias. But first, let me very quickly define what I mean by the establishment. The political establishment is the strong bond that has been formed by career politicians, the large corporations and billionaires that lobby and fund these politicians in return for favorable policies, and the media corporations that rely on access to these politicians and advertising money from these moneyed interests. Attacks on any of these three entities in the bond are in effect attacks on all three of them, because they all rely on each other. And as we'll see, the establishment will work together to repel all attacks. Recall the statistics that I presented to you earlier about the popularity of Medicare for All, and recall how much more overwhelmingly popular it was before this election cycle. As we will see, this is a result of the entire establishment that I mentioned uniting behind a few select talking points, and hammering them into the audience through simple, brute repetition. One of the clearest examples of this unified front against Bernie, and to some extent Warren as well, is on the issue of Medicare for All. Now remember, in every single state in the Democratic primary that we have data for, the majority of Democratic voters preferred Medicare for All over private insurance. That's what the Democratic base wants. If that's the case, why do the Democratic politicians sound like this?
But we don't have to go around and be the party of subtraction and telling half the country who has private health insurance that their health insurance is illegal. My dad, the union electrician, loved the health care he got from the IBEW. He would never want someone to take that away.
At the end of the day, I'm not going to support any plan that rips away quality health care from individuals. This is an example of wish list economics. It used to be just Republicans who wanted to repeal and replace. Now many Democrats do as well.
$30 trillion. $3.4 trillion a year, it turns out, is twice what the entire federal budget is. That's before it exists now, without interest on the debt. How are we going to pay for it? I want to hear tonight how that's happened.
Now, I'm not saying that these are not legitimate questions, but it's not like these questions have never been answered.
What we do, among other proposals in there, is to say, you are that average $60,000 a year family, you're going to pay a 4% tax, exempting the first $29,000, leaving $31,000 of taxable dollars, which is about $1,200 a year. A heck of a lot better than what you're paying today. We also have a payroll tax. We have a payroll tax on employers, which will save them substantial sums of money. Because remember, under Medicare for All, no more premiums for the worker or the employer, no more out-of-pocket expenses, no more deductibles, no more out-of-pocket expenses.
These concerns about Medicare for All have been answered over and over again, and I'll even go so far as to say that these politicians know better. For example, take the $30 trillion cost of Medicare for All. This is a line that is meant to scare voters, but what they never tell you is that Americans are already paying more for healthcare than they would under Medicare for All. This study from the University of Massachusetts Amherst found that Medicare for All over a decade would save over $5 trillion. Then Democratic politicians have another line that Medicare for All actually takes away healthcare.
And the other thing I want to talk about is really what is at the core of this issue between Senator Sanders and the Culinary Union. And that is this. These are hardworking people who have healthcare plans that have been negotiated over time, sweat and blood. There are 149 million Americans that would lose their current health insurance under Senator Sanders' bill.
Again, I have to believe that these politicians know better. If you have a half-empty glass of water and I take it away and give you a refilled full glass of water, it is true that I took your water away, but if you go around telling people I took your water without mentioning the part where I refilled and replaced your water, you're being dishonest, and you know it. Klobuchar and others constantly mention how hard the unions fought for their health insurance, and how unfair it is that Medicare for All would make that fight for nothing. But what they aren't telling you is that in a world with Medicare for All, unions won't ever have to fight for their healthcare ever again. The fact is, these unions and workers never should have had to fight and put their livelihoods on the line to get healthcare in the first place. This argument is akin to saying that vaccines are unfair, because they trivialize the suffering of all the people who have had preventable diseases in the past. This is an argument that falls apart with the slightest scrutiny, and they know it. Now, having attacks from rival politicians is one thing, but attacks disguised as questions from supposedly neutral moderators are another.
Let's start the debate with the number one issue for Democratic voters, health care. And Senator Sanders, let's start with you. You support Medicare for All, which would eventually take private health insurance away from more than 150 million Americans in exchange for government-sponsored health care for everyone. Congressman Delaney just referred to it as bad policy, and previously he has called the idea political suicide that will just get President Trump reelected. What do you say to Congressman Delaney?
In response to this, Bernie said something that is not often pointed out in these debates.
The healthcare industry will be advertising tonight on this program.
Sanders is right. Here's an ad that ran during the debate ad break that night.
We don't want to be forced into a one-size-fits-all government insurance system.
The politicians may call it Medicare for All, Medicare buy-in, or the public option.
But they mean the same thing. Higher taxes or higher premiums.
Lower quality care.
Politicians and bureaucrats in control of our health care.
We can't afford one-size-fits-all plans.
Remember the establishment triangle that I showed you earlier? This is a prime example of how moneyed interests trade, launder, and recycle all the same talking points to attack ideas the establishment doesn't like. Think about this. In the example that I showed you, Jake Tapper used his question as a chance to repeat a line of attack from another politician on the stage, essentially giving that politician free speaking time. Then, that attack would be repeated again by other politicians that same night.
You're going to take private insurance away from 180 million Americans who many of them don't want to give it. Many of them do want to get rid of it, but some don't. That is a disaster at the ballot box. You might as well FedEx the election to Donald Trump.
And then repeated again by six-figure advertisements from the insurance industry that same night. Does that seem fair to you? In another example, when it comes to attacking Sanders, the mainstream media is more than happy to shoehorn and amplify anti-Sanders criticism from Democratic politicians who are not even running. During the primary, both Obama and Hillary Clinton made public comments criticizing Sanders. These criticisms both made it into the debates as questions from the moderators.
Candidates, let's make things interesting. Former President Obama said this week when asked who should be running countries that if women were in charge, you'd see a significant improvement on just about everything. He also said, quote, if you look at the world and look at the problems, it's usually old people, usually old men, not getting out of the way. Senator Sanders, you are the oldest candidate on stage this evening.
And I'm white as well. Yes.
How do you respond to what the former president had to say?
I got a lot of respect for Barack Obama. I think I disagree with him on this one.
Unlike the Obama criticism, the Clinton criticism was so rude and mean-spirited that even Biden and Klobuchar felt compelled to stick up for Bernie.
The Democratic Party's last presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton, has criticized Senator Bernie Sanders' record in the Senate, saying nobody likes him, nobody wants to work with him, he got nothing done. Senator Klobuchar, you serve with Senator Sanders in the Senate. Is he going to be able to get the support? Not if you like him, but is he going to be able to get the support that he needs from Republicans?
Okay, I like Bernie just fine. We actually have worked together on a number of things, including pharmaceuticals.
Here's my point. Not only are Obama and Clinton not running in this race, their opposition to Sanders stands against the wishes of the Democratic voters. The voters agree with Sanders, not them. So why does the media pick up and use their question time as a chance to amplify these criticisms of Sanders? It's to send a message to the Democratic base. Viewership for these debates is very high, and if you want to get the most people to get a particular message, this is the time to send it. Obama said the words, and the debate is the time to repeat those words to an audience of millions while disguising it as a question. At the end of this multifaceted echo chamber, the audience is meant to internalize a certain feeling. The feeling that even if they like Sanders, as Hillary Clinton put it, no one else does. Not all media bias is as subtle as the techniques we just saw. Sometimes the bias is just obvious. On MSNBC, for example, the anti-Bernie sentiment presents itself in ways that range from the absurd.
Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl, and I can't even identify for you what exactly it is.
To the hysterical.
I remember the Cold War. I have an attitude towards Castro. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed. And certain other people would be there cheering, okay? So I have a problem with people who took the other side. I don't know who Bernie supports over these years. I don't know what he means by social. 1 week it's Denmark. We're going to be like Denmark. Denmark is harmless.
He's pretty clearly in the Denmark category, yeah.
Are you sure? How do you know? Did he tell you that?
Well, I mean, that's what he says, and that's what his agenda calls for, right?
Yeah.
He's not calling for any...
Let's see. Let's figure that one out.
And let's not forget about the two separate occasions in which Bernie Sanders and his supporters were compared to literal Nazis.
Bernie, on the other hand, did his job. He got more than a majority of that 67%. That is the name of the game. It is pretty much over unless that changes. I was reading last night, Brian, I know you're a history guy too. I'm reading last night about the fall of France in the summer of 1940. And the general, Renault, calls up Churchill and says, "It's over." And Churchill said, "How can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over?" He said, "It's over."
And Ruth, we've all been on the receiving end of the Bernie online brigade. And here's what he says. He says, "No other candidate has anything like this sort of digital brown shirt brigade. I mean, except for Donald Trump. The question no one is asking is this: what if you can't win the presidency without an online mob? What if we now live in a world where having a bullying agro-social media army running around, popping anyone who sticks their head up is either an important ingredient for or a critical marker of success?"
Wow. Okay, that's
I know everybody's freaking out about this, but you saw the MAGA rally that's preparing around.
Like I said, I could go on for hours about the many cases of ridiculous spin that Sanders and his supporters have been subjected to, but I highly prefer quantitative analyses over lists of anecdotes. To this end, a publication called In These Times have done just exactly this with two analyses, with interesting results. One analysis of CNN coverage compared how CNN covered Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in the 24 hours following their big wins in Nevada and South Carolina. What they found is that Bernie Sanders got over 3 times more negative coverage than Biden did. However, not all negative coverage is equally negative. After Biden's South Carolina win, one instance of negative coverage is Hillary Rosen saying that Biden could be more inspirational. On the other hand, after Sanders won Nevada, Jake Tapper began a segment by announcing that Russia was interfering in U.S. politics by backing Sanders' campaign, and they brought on Linda Chavez, a former official in the Reagan administration, to say this, quote, "The problem is the real winner last night, I believe, was Putin. I mean, we're going to have the most divisive election of Bernie as the nominee, and we're going to see two very, very angry people representing two very different extremes of their parties. And I think that helps make America more chaotic. It makes us more divisive. And I think the one that gets advantage by that is Russia." Unquote. Also notable was that CNN brought on Biden for an interview after his victory, but didn't do the same for Sanders. In These Times also did a similar analysis of MSNBC segments from August and September of 2019, analyzing coverage from 6 shows. What they found is that Sanders received less than 1/3 of the coverage Biden got, less coverage than Elizabeth Warren, and the most negative coverage overall. Most negative coverage of Biden focused on his gaffes and how they might affect his electability. Biden's reliance for funding from the healthcare and banking industries was never covered. Meanwhile, Medicare for All was characterized as throwing millions of people off their healthcare and as a tax hike. Sound familiar? On Brian Williams' 11th Hour show, Republican Rick Wilson was brought on to call Sanders a communist and a recipe for electoral disaster. Anyway, in this video we focus mainly on bias against Bernie, but I don't want to leave the impression that Sanders was the only candidate who suffered from this treatment. Elizabeth Warren, the other prominent progressive in the race, received similar attacks during the debates.
Senator Warren, I have a question for you. Every candidate on the stage has proposed tax increases on the wealthy, but you have especially ambitious plans that, apart from health care, would hike taxes an additional $8 trillion over the decade, the biggest tax increase since World War II. How do you answer top economists who say taxes of this magnitude would stifle growth and investment?
On the other hand, the other candidates and the media didn't even seem to think that Andrew Yang, who championed the very unusual policy of a universal basic income, was even worth attacking. Yang was barely mentioned and consistently got the least speaking time in the Democratic debates. I mention all this because I don't think that the mainstream media has it out specifically for Bernie as a person. Again, these media companies are multi-billion-dollar companies, run by billionaires, hosted by millionaires, and dependent on other billionaires for advertising revenue. When you add all this up, you create a media ecosystem where the quality of an idea is judged by how similar it is to the status quo. The popularity of progressive ideas, which attacks a system that the media benefits greatly from, serves as an indictment of the legitimacy of these media companies. That's why Bernie Sanders makes the TV pundits skin crawl. That's why Chris Matthews' imagination jumps to being executed at the prospect of a Sanders victory. Even if they don't admit it out loud, the mainstream media ecosystem has every emotional and financial incentive to oppose progressive ideas and gatekeep ideas that don't conform to the status quo. In conclusion, as we've shown, a significant portion of Biden's voters agreed with Bernie's policies over Biden's and voted for Biden anyway. Bernie Sanders lost despite his popular ideas. What can we take away from this? First, I want to point out that, in this sense, Democratic voters are actually more conservative than Republican voters. When Donald Trump was running in 2015, he called for building a giant wall on the southern border, financing it by making Mexico pay for it. And then he proposed getting Bill Gates to help shut down the internet to combat ISIS recruitment. And that's just two of the things he said. Donald Trump was elected president and consistently holds about a 90% approval rating among his party. That 90% never asked how feasible these ideas were. They never asked how much it would cost. They never asked whether or not Trump would appeal to the average voter or if Trump would appeal to moderate voters. Trump's base never cared a single bit about getting votes from moderates or from liberals. In fact, they openly celebrated the fact that liberals found their ideas abhorrent and offensive. And yet, as it turns out, if you can energize a strong base of passionate voters instead of watering down all your ideas, you can win. And yet, Democrats, instead of just voting for the policies they think are best, tied themselves into knots asking themselves, well, what do the moderates think? How can we appeal to moderate Republicans? My advice, if you want to win, stop thinking like this and focus on policies that will help people. Second, what can we do to create a better media ecosystem that focuses more on substance and truly represents the country? Now, I'll admit I may be a bit biased here, but I think that supporting new media on online platforms such as YouTube is our best bet right now. These are news sources that do not rely on big money advertisements, rely on their audience, and do not pretend to be neutral, but instead aim to be objective. For some recommendations that I like on YouTube, in no particular order, Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk, The Young Turks, The Majority Report with Sam Cedar, and I would have strongly recommended this person, but they tragically passed away during the making of this video. So instead, I'll say, rest in power, Michael Brooks. Oh, remember that Jason Johnson guy I mentioned earlier? Well, as he said himself, he is a regular contributor to MSNBC. At least, he was until he let the mask slip on a radio show.
However, a large number of bargain basement, pathetic, doubly intensely ignorant, bigoted white boys who masquerade as liberals, who find themselves consistently in support of Bernie Sanders online, have decided that they want to make this part of their meme. I do find it fascinating that racist liberal whites seem to love them some Bernie Sanders consistently and always have a problem with any person of color who doesn't want to follow with the orthodoxy of their Lord and Savior Bernie Sanders. The man cares nothing for intersectionality. And I don't care how many people from the island of misfit black girls that you throw out to defend you on a regular basis. It doesn't mean that your campaign is serious.
Crossed the line, sir.
I don't care. I don't care.
MSNBC, to their credit, stopped having him on after this. Until they brought him back 5 months later.
Joining our conversation, our friend Jason Johnson, a professor of journalism and politics at Morgan State University, is back. Plus, editor-at-large for The Bulwark, Charlie Sykes, is here. Lucky for us, both of them MSNBC contributors. Jason, let me welcome you back to this program. We have missed you, my friend.
Awkward. I'd now like to sincerely thank my patrons who make videos like these possible. Finite Difference, Posty, FArank Moraes, Anthony Ha, Nicholas Ball, Max Schulte, Tangible Dust, Aramet, Anime Titty Fan, Red Wing, Milk Toast, Elizabeth, John Boy, Akbash Akita, David Lamb, Jordan Braunstein, Jack King Spooner, Reese Iyer, I Forgot My Name, Frantic Atlantic, Christian Nygaard, David Fuller, Sugar and Stan, Sina. Thank you all so much as always, and I'll see you all in the next one.